Hello and welcome back to A Drunk History Middle-earth. It is me, Chris, and today we're going to talk about Sauron. We're going to continue on with the series. Now, I hope that you enjoyed the episode we did with Kaya, where it was me and Kaya talking about feminism, Ungoliants, and all that good stuff. I had a great time, and some other things have sprung up from that episode-wise, which have been interesting, so we'll save that for a rainy day, though. How are you? How are you doing? You good? You driving? You walking? You doing a school run, maybe? Or have you just put on your noise-cancelling headphones so you can ignore everyone around you? All of these things happen for listeners of this podcast, I'm sure. So, if you remember, at the end of the last episode, we talked about, well, the whole of the last Sauron episode, we talked about what makes a Dark Lord, why his power is better in some aspects, why he's more powerful in some aspects than Morgoth, why he's weaker than others, and the motivations behind said power. So now we're ready to start talking about Sauron as a character in a story, the events he was involved in. And to do that, psych bitch, you thought, no, we've got some other stuff first. We're going to talk about the other versions of his character, because there's a couple. Now, Sauron has been around, he's one of the earliest characters in Tolkien's Legendarium. He's been there since almost the beginning, when Morgoth was called Melkor, when elves were gnomes, when the Fae and fairies were still written about, and Valinor wasn't Valinor, Middle-earth was called the Great Lands, blah, blah, blah. Like, he's been around, but he's been around in different guises, and there are characters that share some traits that would then split off and become different characters, blah, blah, blah. So today we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about two of the main ones, as well as mention a couple of the others. But before that, I did think we would be safe giving ourselves a little teaser of some of the events, because the next episode I do on Sauron, I plan to start in the First Age proper, like the rising of the sun in the published Silmarillion First Age, because we're finally ready to tackle quote-unquote canon Sauron. So before that, we'll talk about before that, and if you cast your minds back to one of the earliest episodes Becca and myself did, it was the Spring of Arda, I think, is one of the last events we covered in the Silmarillion proper, like when we did a few episodes that were just the beginning of the world. And the Spring of Arda is when the Valar and all of the Maiar, the spirits, the great spirits who built the world, had finished their work, and they'd built the landmass of the planet, and there was a gigantic lake, and then in the middle of that lake was an island called Almaren, or Almaren. And this is where the Valar gathered themselves and all the Ainur spirits. And they had a great feast, because Morgoth had been banished, he'd been kicked out, or he'd fled over the mountains right to the north, and he was outside of the world. He'd fled. And it was at this feast that they had a good time. I think Tulkas married Nienna, maybe. I think they might have got married here, I'm not quite sure. And then Tulkas fell asleep. But when Tulkas fell asleep is when Morgoth crept back into the world, destroyed the two lamps that used to light the world before the sun and the moon, caused a continental shift into the landmass that we know now, and the Valar went west to hole up in their hallowed land. So Sauron was said to be amongst the spies of Morgoth at the great feast that the Valar held, and a quote was, "Now Melkor, i.e. Morgoth, knew of all that was done, for even then he had secret friends and spies among the Maiar, whom he had converted to his cause, and of these the chief, as ever after became known, was Sauron, a great craftsman of the household of Aule." And we know, we've spoke before, that Sauron is a Maiar, a spirit of Aule, who was the smith. So was Saruman. So Aule is 2 for 2 on pupils who turn evil, but let's not hold that against him. But that passage appears the passage I've just read appears in different versions depending on when the writing was done, blah blah blah. But it always seems to reference Sauron being a spy. Sometimes he's referred to as the chief of the Maiar who turned to Morgoth. But we know that even at this blissful start of the world, Sauron was one of the reasons Morgoth was able to creep back into the world, over the walls of night that surround the world, and start to delve into the ground to build Autumno, i.e. like hell on earth. And that's when he starts to, he'd also start to creep out his stain into the world, the shadow of Morgoth, his taint, as Becca would giggle about. But then Morgoth would later come forth and bring the lamps of the world crashing down. So we do know that from this, Sauron had an indirect hand in the shaping of the continents. So he is still a prick. Like I said, the Valar then left the Middle-earth for Aman, and the world fell into stillness and darkness. Morgoth ruled at this time without limit until the elves awoke, and then the shit kicked off again. And it was in this darkness that at some point in all of this, Sauron left Aman for Middle-earth and went and properly bent the knee to Morgoth, becoming a full-time baddie as opposed to part-time, I guess, just instead of being a spy. But, predictably, before we go any further with that, I want to cover other versions of Sauron in the Legendarium before he became the Sauron that we know and do not love. So when we first talk about Sauron in the early ages of Middle-earth, we need to talk about the alternate versions of him that crop up. These are generally two big identity makeovers he gets. And there was an argument to be made, and I know Christopher Tolkien made this argument, which I think I'll point out later, is that there's not so much a direct kind of continuation of evolution. It's not like they slowly morphed. It's just like sometimes a character was replaced by a similar character but with different traits. But we do have a very solid evolution or line from the earliest versions of Sauron before he was called that to what we know as Sauron today. So you need to also bear in mind that if you've only seen Lord of the Rings, the films, you need to understand that the books, The Lord of the Rings, and The Hobbit were kind of like final versions of certain stories Tolkien wanted to tell. But even then, he was still changing things right up until he died. But Tolkien was writing for around 50 years, from 1917 all the way up to his death, right? In like 1977, so like 60 years maybe, right? And in this whole time, that's like 50, 60 years of pure content, but he was constantly changing the world, and it was big changes. So you need to bear that in mind, that just because Lord of the Rings is the story that we see, or the story that we read, that a lot of those characters went through massive, massive revisions, and some were omitted entirely, some were broken up, and aspects of them were given to other characters, and all of that. And Sauron's no exception. And there's two big ones, two big identities. The first one is Tevildo, Prince of Cats, and then we have Thu. And Thu is first called Thu the Hunter, then he becomes Thu the Necromancer. But Thu also replaces a smaller servant of Morgoth called Thankiel, and serves the same role. So at a certain point, Thankiel got eliminated from the Legendarium, and his attributes were rolled into Sauron. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about. So let's discuss Tevildo first. Just to say as well. I'm not sorry. Fuck you. You don't listen to me to hear me apologise. So we'll discuss Tevildo first, right? And these versions that we're going to talk about, they mainly are to do with the Lay of Leithian, which is the story of Beren and Luthien. And that is a love story for the ages about a mortal man, Beren, and who he falls in love with an elf woman, Luthien. But before he can marry her, he has to go on a quest to steal a Silmaril, i.e. one of the most precious jewels in history, that Morgoth, i.e. the devil, has stolen and is wearing in an iron crown. So there's 3 Silmarils. Morgoth is wearing them in a crown on his head in hell, essentially, right? To put it very, very, very bluntly and very quickly. The jewels were made by Feanor, who you may have heard me talk about before. If not, go and listen to the Noldor series. So in the earliest versions of this tale, Tevildo is called Prince of Cats, and in Gnomish, and Gnomish is a language that we would come to know as Sindarin, and that also goes through some evolutions. Tevildo was called Tifil, or Tiberth. And he also had titles in the Quenya language, the early Quenya language, called Vardo Meowtia, and in Gnomish, this was Brithon Meowgion, both meaning Prince of Cats. Now, obviously, you heard the meow sound there, so Tolkien obviously has a bit of... he obviously had a bit of a sense of humour. But apparently, now, this is where it gets interesting, some of Tolkien's inspiration for Tevildo as a cat didn't just come from his dislike of cats, which, was documented, but funnily enough, like, a lot of the early versions of Beren and Luthien was just very cat versus dog. Like, it was literally a lot of cat versus dog shit went on, and I don't know why. But one of the possible inspirations of Tevildo was possibly Tybalt in Romeo and Juliet, who was also called the Prince of Cats. And we've seen inspiration from Shakespeare in Tolkien before. So most notably for this podcast, in the Ent episode, I talked about the prophecy in Macbeth about the coming of Great Burnham Wood to hide Dunsinane Hill, and that was about the soldiers using branches from the wood as camouflage instead of the woods themselves moving. And Tolkien was apparently Tolkien was fuming with this, and he said he wanted to see actual trees marching to war. But that, again, go into a bit more detail in the End episode. But as a slight aside, I don't know about anybody else. Like, I'm in my 30s now, and Tybalt for me is always John Leguizamo from the movie, like the Romeo and Juliet movie in 1996, and I love rewatching that because it's the guy's just pure menace. Like that beginning scene at the petrol station or the gas station for the Americans, where he's like, "Peace, peace." I hate the word, as I hate hell, all Montagues, and thee. And then the kid comes out with the gun, going bang, bang, and he turns around and he's got a gun in the kid's fist, goes bang. Do you reckon Tolkien would have liked that adaptation of Shakespeare? Because I think they just kept all the dialogue exactly the same, but put it in like modern times, which I think worked really well. I want to see more of that. Anyway, another source of inspiration for Tevildo, this big monstrous prince of cats who's evil, might have been Cathpolwch, which is a monstrous cat from the tales of King Arthur. And this cat, in legend, was given birth to by a massive white pig called Henwen. And apparently the pig gave birth to a cat, and the kitten was thrown into the sea, where it swam away and lived on the Eye of Anglesey, until in some versions of the tale, either King Arthur himself or his seneschal, his brother Kay, went and hunted it down. And some stories have other big heroes of the time, like there was a guy called Ogier the Dane, who was a paladin of Charlemagne, who was meant to have went and fought the cat and won. And that was a little... honestly, I had to pull myself out of this because it was a rabbit hole I went into. And the legend itself comes from the Pargoivi Porthi, in which it says that, it's a Welsh poem, obviously, that 180 warriors were killed by the cat before it was defeated. That's fucking awesome. That is cool as shit. So anyway, back to the tale of Beren and Luthien. I'm drinking whiskey, so I'm taking a little drink break. In the tale of Beren and Luthien, Tevildo lives in a castle on a cliff, which is not far from the fortress of Angmandi. Now, Angmandi is an early version of Angband, which is where Morgoth lived in this version. But you'll have heard the word Angband before. If not, I've got a lovely episode on Autumno, Angband and Hell in Tolkien. But Tevildo had an army of cats that feared big dogs. And there was a pack of big dogs that lived in the woods nearby, led by the goodest boy in Tolkien, called Huan, who was also slightly different in this version. In the published Silmarillion, Huan is the Hound of the Valar, and he's granted speech 3 times in his life, and he has some kind of like prophecy about him as well, which is pretty cool, which I think I might have covered before in like the werewolves episode. Fuck me, this episode is just telling you to go and listen to other episodes. But anyway, the two, Tevildo and Huan, would fight again and again in different versions of this story. Like they'd always fight in some capacity, Sauron and this dog. But this time they fought as cat and dog. And in later versions, Sauron would fight him as a werewolf due to a prophecy, like I mentioned. But as a quick aside, by the way, this castle is described as like 4 cats, and these cats are monstrous, evil cats. Like they are like human size, maybe bigger, who knows. They are big cats. And I had a funny thought of the Khajiit from Skyrim just wandering around, just asking if you have wares if you have coin. But there's it's got rooms in there. It's got rooms in the castle specifically for cats, and one of the funniest ones I heard was a sunning terrace. Now, I'm not posh enough to know whether a sunning terrace is a real thing in real castles, but I do think if a cat ever ordered a castle to be built, they'd be like, give me somewhere I can just lie in the sun and warm my belly. But also the cats have like quite hilarious names, like Meowly, like as in the Maya Owle, but the Meow sounds as well. So Meowly. And then I also mentioned some cat-like names earlier. And as I said, Christopher Tolkien seemed to be of the opinion that Tevildo wasn't really a precursor to Sauron. He was just a villain-shaped hole that Tevildo filled, then Thu filled, then Sauron filled. But to me, this doesn't quite track, because I think it is a pure... there is a throughput. Like, obviously, Sauron doesn't have many feline traits. Arguably, the slit-like pupil might be one to put there. But in this version of the story, with Tevildo, Prince of Cats, he has a golden collar that gives him evil power, and he wears it constantly. And in lots of versions, he's depicted as a monstrous black cat. So, in the story, Beren is captured on his adventure, and he's sent to Tevildo as a slave. And Tevildo hates him straight away because he smells that Beren likes dogs more than cats. And so he sets him an impossible task, because Tevildo likes to allow giant mice and rats to live in the castle to amuse him. And he knows that they are quite fierce and very difficult to catch, which to a cat is a great sport, but to a human, So, he sets Beren a task to catch 3 giant and fierce mice in 3 days. Beren fails, and so he is forced to work in the kitchens until he is so miserable that he actually wishes he'd never met Luthien. Luthien comes to rescue Beren eventually and tricks the servants at the castle, and then tricks Tevildo himself to allow Beren to know that she's there. She makes her presence known to him. So Luthien then lies and tells Tevildo that Huan was injured in the woods nearby, so he sets off to go and fight, he's one of his greatest enemies. But it's an ambush. And Tevildo gets chased up a tree, a cat gets chased up a tree by a dog, after he scratches Huan in the eye while they're fighting. Huan refuses to let him down from the tree until Tevildo tells Huan, 1, where Beren and Luthien are, 2, throw down his magic collar, and 3, tell Huan the words to the spell, which keeps the castle standing and makes his subjects, which were ordinary cats made by evil magic, until it reverses that magic and just makes them ordinary cats again. So once Huan has all this, presumably Tevildo was free to go. So then Luthien returns to the castle, and she breaks the spell, and she then commands the now shrunken cats to release all the prisoners. And there's 2 prisoners. One is Beren, and the other one, and this is very interesting, this is a bit of a reveal, there is a blind elf called Gimli. And in the Gnomish language, which would later become Sindarin, Gimli means sense of hearing, which is pretty accurate because, he's got a good sense of hearing because he's fucking blind. That then makes me wonder that is that like a joke later in Lothlorien in the Third Age, where Gimli's talking about how he's got like the ears of a fox or something, and then Haldir says he breathed so loud he could have shot him in the dark. Like, is that just the most subtle of nods to this very early version of Gimli the blind elf? Who knows? I might have got that quote wrong. Anyway, after all this, Morgoth learns what's happened, and he banishes Tevildo, and he curses him. So Tevildo, i.e. our Sauron in this version, gets cursed, and he spends the rest of his life bitter and angry about everything he'd lost. But so did the whole race of cats forever. So Tolkien, in his Legendarium, actually has a canon reason for cats being arseholes. He is a dedicated hater. He wakes up and he thinks, I'm going to go for the Player Haters Award of the Year by giving cats an actual reason for being arseholes. And that is just brava. Like, if you spend that much time giving me a reason to tell me all cats are dickheads, that you write a story about it, then fair dues, that's proper mythology. But that's Tevildo. That's Tevildo, the Prince of Cats, which I find fascinating. And next we're going to look at Thu. First Thu the Hunter and Thu the Necromancer. But first, I'm going to have a drink. It's Monkey Shoulder. It's not a sponsor. I just fancied some whiskey tonight. But if you're listening to this during the day, obviously don't start drinking. That's not good. Right. Thu. Another version of Sauron. This one's got some poetry in it. So another version of Sauron was called Thu, or Gorthu in Gnomish, which we've heard about as the earliest version of Sindarin. Another name for Thu is Sur in Kenya. And Kenya is the earliest version of the language Quenya. And the difference in spelling is the early version is Qenya, and the quote-unquote more modern version is Quenya of the language. So it's Quenya, Kenya, whatever the fuck, I don't know. But so what Thu's name means is stench, evil mist, or darkness, which comes from the root Thus. But in later stories, his name becomes Gorthu and Sur, and eventually becomes Thauron, which is pronounced Sauron in common Quenya. Now this, I would this is just this. Don't worry about this one. Anybody who's familiar with the linguistics of Tolkien on a bigger level, or has listened to my episode with where me and Becca talked to Alex Pointy-Eared about Feanor, we discussed the use of the letter thorn, which is a th sound, and the letter thorn it's like a rune. It's like a P, but the curve of the P is halfway down the line, and that's pronounced th. And it became a thing in Quenya that whether you pronounced it as th or you moved to the S sound, s. So interestingly, in common Quenya, Thauron became Sauron with a similar name. But then in another source later on, Thu is given the Sindarin translation of Sulimo, which is one of the names that Manwë has, which is related to the word Sul, which means wind. So his names, like I said, either mean stench, evil mist, darkness, or wind. But if you want to get real jiggy with it, I reckon you should tell everyone that Sauron's name means fart on the wind. Just because. So Thu first appears in the Lay of Leithian, which I've talked about a fuckload now. It's one of my favourite epic poems. But to avoid any doubt of what it is, the Lay of Leithian is a very, 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 very long Elvish poem, which tells the story of Beren and Luthien, of them stealing a Silmaril and their various shenanigans. It usually ends with both of their deaths after stealing the Silmaril. Beren dies, Luthien sings for Mandos, moves him, she gets Beren returned to life, she lives as a human, and they pass away together. blah, 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 blah. We'll eventually cover it, but it is a very fucking big story. But in the earliest drafts of the Tolkien's Legendarium, back when it was still full of fairies and gnomes, but relax, gay listeners. When I say fairies, I'm talking about the fae. There was a character called Tuvo who met Morgoth while he was imprisoned in the halls of Mandos, when he was in prison. And he was corrupted by him because Morgoth taught this guy a lot of black magic. And Tuvo went on to be an evil wizard king and left for the Great Lands, and the Great Lands being Middle-earth. But this character then kind of split, right? Because later on, there were versions of this guy renamed Tu. And Tu became a protector of elves and men and a king of the Isildi. And the Isildi, which were elves who never reached what was a very, very, very early version of Valinor. Like I said, the stories changed massively over the decades. And that's a whole thing that was dropped as the world of Middle-earth developed. But from this, we got the character Thu, who was now, instead of being an evil cat, was called Lord of Werewolves, and replaced the character of Tevildo, who you might have heard of before. We've just covered him. So Thu took on the characteristics of another character called Fankil, an early servant of Morgoth who escaped into the world when the Valar broke open Autumno, which was at the time was called Utumna. At the time, so if you imagine the elves woke up, the Valar were concerned about Morgoth ruling over them. They went to war for the sake of the elves, and as part of this, they literally peeled back the roof of Autumno and took Morgoth prisoner, and they arrested or destroyed everyone they could. But in this version, this character called Fankil escaped into the world when this happened. But this character, Fankil, he escaped Autumno, and he lived among the first humans. And what he did was, him, the dwarves, and the goblins worked in tandem. They worked together to estrange humans from elves, so that humans and elves would become enemies. It's also worth noting, now this is worth a deep dive in itself, dwarves in the earliest versions of the Legendarium, they were evil. So they were baddies. So Sauron, goblins or orcs, and dwarves all worked together at one point. Fankil would later become Tevildo, who became Thu, who became Sauron, blah blah blah. Back to the Lay of Leithian, which is the story of Beren and Luthien. Thu holds and rules the Wizard's Isle, also later known as Tolingauroth, which translates to the Isle of Werewolves, which did begin its life as the first Minas Tirith, which is the same place with many different names, and it's very significant to the history of the First Age. Now, next episode with Sauron, where we start to talk about the proper events of the First Age in the published Silmarillion, Minas Tirith is held by Orodreth, an elf, who loses it to Sauron, and then it becomes the Isle of Werewolves, where he starts to breed, well, werewolves. But obviously, this Minas Tirith is the namesake. It's the reason that the Minas Tirith in Gondor gets its name. It's named after this place on the First Age. But in the story, in his tower, Thu spots Beren and Finrod Felagund from the tower when they're on their quest to steal a Silmaril from Morgoth. He interrogates them because there's 12 of them, right? There's Beren, there's Finrod, and there's 10 elves. And they're disguised as orcs. So he interrogates, and this is where it starts to mirror the published Silmarillion. He interrogates them before him and Felagund engage of their songs of power and wizardry. Thu defeats Finrod Felagund. All of them are thrown into a dungeon where a werewolf devours them one by one. Felagund this is where Finrod Felagund dies, because he kills a werewolf with his hands and allows Beren to escape. But that's kind of more for another episode. A fitting end to one of the greatest elves to ever live, like an absolute hero. And this is where I'm going to read a little part of the Lay of Leithian that introduces Thu, the necromancer. And, you know, by now you should know that I love the poetry, especially rhyming couplets. So, now in that hill was the abode of one most evil, and the road that from Beleriand thither came, he watched with eyes of sleepless flame. From the north there led no other way, save east where the gorge of Aglon lay, and that dark path was hurrying dread, which only in need the orcs would tread, through deadly nightshade's awful gloom, where Tar Nafuin's branches loom. And Aglon led to Doriath, and Feanor's sons watched ere that path. Men called him Thu, and as a god, in after days beneath his rod, bewildered bowed to him and made his ghastly temples in the shade. Not yet by men enthralled adored, now was he Morgoth's mightiest lord, master of wolves whose shivering howl forever echoed in the hills and foul. Enchantments and dark sigildry did weave and wield in glamoury, that necromancer held his hosts of phantoms and of wandering ghosts, of misbegotten or spell-wronged monsters that about him thronged, working his bidding dark and vile, the werewolves of the Wizard's Isle. From Thu their coming was not hid, and though beneath the eaves they slid, of the forest's gloomy hanging boughs, he saw them afar, and wolves did rouse. "Go, fetch me those sneaking orcs," he said, "that fare thus strangely as if in dread, and do not come as all orcs use, and are commanded to bring me news of all their deeds to me, to Thu." From his tower he gazed, and in him grew suspicion and a brooding thought, waiting, leering till they were brought. Now ringed about with wolves they stand, and fear the doom, alas, the land of Narog left behind. Foreboding evil weighs their mind, as downcast halting they must go, and cross the stony bridge of war, to Wizard's Isle and to the throne, there fashioned of blood-darkened stone. So Thu interrogates Beren and Felagund and the others about who they are, because they're disguised as orcs, right? Felagund uses his elf magic, shout out elf magic episode. It's an illusion, and he's suspicious of them. And I'll read some more of this, and there will be more poetry in this, because a lot of Sauron's... in this series there will be more poetry, because the tale of Gorlim the Grim, which we might cover next Sauron episode, is pure heartbreak. But a lot of Sauron's direct dialogue comes about in poetry. I've found out from my research. And, you know, I think it's always nice to share good poems with people. But this is pure malice. So this is one of the most famous kind of fights that Finrod, Felagund and Sauron have, because it's an open display of power between an elf and a Maiar. And this is... so they start fighting, and Sauron says... Thu says, "Whom do ye serve, light or murk? Who is the maker of mightiest work? Who is the king of earthly kings, the greatest giver of gold and rings? Who is the master of the wide earth, who despoiled them of their mirth? The greedy gods, repeat your vows. Orcs of Bauglia, do not bend your brows. Deaf to light, to law, to love, cursed be moons and stars above. May darkness everlasting old, that waits outside and surges cold, drown Manwë, Vardar, and the sun. May all in hatred be begun, and all in evil ended be, in the morning of the endless sea. But no true man nor elf yet free would ever speak that blasphemy." And Beren muttered, "Who is Thu, to hinder work that is to do? Him we serve not, nor to him obeisance, and now we would go." Thu laughed. "Patience not very long shall ye abide, but first a song I will sing to you, to ears intent." Then his flaming eyes he on them bent, and darkness black fell round them all. Only they saw as through a pall of eddying smoke those eyes profound, in which their senses choked and drowned. He chanted a song of wizardry, of piercing, opening, of treachery, revealing, uncovering, betraying. Then sudden Felagund their swaying sang in answer a song of staying, resistance battling against power, of secrets kept, strength like a tower. and trust unbroken, freedom, escape, of changing and of shifting shape, of snares eluded, broken traps, the prison and opening, the chain that snaps. Backwards and forwards swayed their song, reeling and foundering as ever more strong. Thu's chanting swelled, Felagund fought, and all the magic and might he brought, of elfiness into his words. Softly in the gloom they heard the birds, singing afar in Nargothrond, the sighing of the sea beyond. Beyond the western world on sand of pearls in elven land. Then the gloom gathered, darkness growing, and Valinor, the red blood flowing. Beside the sea, where the gnomes slew the foam riders, and stealing drew their white ships with their white sails. From lamplit havens the wind wails, the wolf howls, the ravens flee, the ice mutters in the mouths of sea. The captives sad in Angband mourn, thunder rumbles, the fire's born. A vast smoke gushes out a roar, and Felagund sways upon the floor. Now, what was interesting about that is, did you pick up on the reference to the sleepless eyes of flame? Because that's something that will certainly stick around. So then Thu takes on the form of a giant werewolf to fight Huan, but is defeated and he's forced to hand over the keys to the island. He gets bitten by the neck by Huan, and when defeated he flies away in the form of a vampire. So, for the eagle-eyed, as I mentioned, you'll see this is super duper mega close to how the events go with Sauron. We're at the point of minor changes now. Like, mainly just, like, name alone. But then we get a little bit more of the second age stuff. And I'm just going to take a drink. So, Thu escapes the War of Wrath, called the Battle Terrible, in early versions. Good job changing the name there, Tolkien. And he flees to Middle-earth, where humans begin to worship him and serve him. And he then crops up again in the second age, what would become the second age, in the earliest versions of the Tale of Numenor, which was called Atlantis at first. And his name in Quenya is said to be Sur, and still Thu in Gnomish. And he arrives on Numenor in the form of a great bird during the reign of King Angor and Queen Istar. Now, part of me wonders, in the Rings of Power, there is a scene where Ar-Pharazôn sees a bird and takes it as a sign of like, oh shit, I should reign. And we know that's not right. We know he's a cunt, and we know that's not right. And I wonder if it was kind of like a reference to this. I don't know. Tell me what you think. Come and talk to me. But then he continues to do Sauron stuff in Numenor. He convinces the Numenorians to try and invade the West to gain eternal life, yada, yada, yada. We're going to have to get to that at some point. Numenor is very tied up with Sauron. But after the fall of Numenor, or Atlantis or whatever, the ones who remained faithful to the Valar land in Middle-earth and ally themselves with the elves as normal. And I saw a reference to, like, either it was Elrond in an early version / King Gil-galad, but whatever. And they group up to attack Sur, or Thu, in his new fortress. And apparently, in this text, is the second version of this text, is the first time the word Mordor appears in Tolkien. And in the fight, Thu kills the king, but he's defeated and his body's destroyed, plus the servants are dispersed. Or, more vaguely, depending on the version, Thu is driven out of the Iron Forest, that would later be called Mirkwood, depending on the version. And that's it, and that is the end of Thu, the Necromancer, which you can see, a lot of it is very... You can see how it's like small jumps to Sauron there. But that is what I wanted to bring to you today before we started to talk about the first age, because that now brings us to the end of the episode on different versions of Sauron, which is now shaping up to be a heck of a series. So yeah, that is that. That's a quick one I wanted to go through. Next episode about Sauron will be about his first age shenanigans. I might release something in between. I've not quite made my mind up yet. But as you've seen, this is a proper deep dive. And as we go on, we're going to take things slowly. So by the time this is over, you will be a certified authority on Sauron. But I just want to say goodbye from me. Have a fantastic day wherever you are. As I've been recording just then, my big soundproof screen I use started to tilt over and I had to lunge and grab it. Pleased to say I did. I hope that didn't come through on the recording. But have a fantastic day wherever you are. Come and talk to me. Come and hang out in the Discord. You can find the socials. If you want to come and join my WoW guild, come and talk to me about that. It's called Forehead Kisses. I'm on WoW Classic on Thunderstrike, which is EU. Other than that, I will catch you in a bit. Bye.